Harold Bloom is one of the greatest and most prolific American literary critics today. He is currently Sterling Professor of Humanities at Yale University and Berg Professor of English at New York University. He is author of more than 20 books, including The Anxiety of Influence, The Western Canon, and Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. In his most recent book, How to Read and Why, he stresses the importance of reading as a form of personal pleasure and essential to the discovery of self. I am pleased to have him here on his 70th birthday. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Charles.
How do you feel? See, first of all, I love you calling me Charles because, I mean, it so thrills me, I can't tell you. I could go the rest of my life and everybody could call me Charles and I'd be happy.
Like everybody else who turned 70, I am delighted to be here when one considers all the alternatives.
Alternatives, that's right. Who first wrote that? Was it Twain or somebody?
I think, well, Twain uses it, but it goes further back than that. It must be as old as humankind.
So people say, why is Harold Bloom, this great literary critic who writes about Shakespeare and ages of influence and lots of other things, why is he telling us how to read a book?
Well, we have reached...
Sounds like a self-help primer.
Well, there is a self-help aspect to it, I'm glad to say. I mean, usually self-help books are pretty ghastly,
right,
as we all know, just as inspirational books, as publishers call them, are pretty awful. But I hope this redeems both modes to some degree. No, this is an attempt to write an authentically reader-friendly book. I've been writing a lot of books through the years. I have been teaching for 45 years. I increasingly felt that I wanted to be much more simple and much more direct, and even if necessary, even more personal. And that I wanted to talk about how desperately we all of us need to keep reading. You can't think at all clearly or well without memory. And it matters a great deal what you remember. And if what you remember is mediocre stuff, you're not going to be able to think very well. And if as a nation we stop thinking well, someday we will yet cease to be a democracy. It really matters reading the best that has been written ever, the best that has been thought ever.
We'll get to the substance and the content of this book, but is part of what motivates you now not sort of notions of mortality, but in a sense is I want to make sure that what I consider crucial and essential, one, Shakespeare and the invention of human, and the essential necessity of reading for pleasure and for discovery and for understanding where you fit, and that these are sort of, if nothing else, these are the messages I want people to know.
You know, that's pretty well right, Charles. One can teach, you can teach for 45 years as I have, and I hope I will teach another 15 or whatever, but you can teach in the end face-to-face only a certain number of students. Maybe by now, in my case, it must be 35,000 students, but that still has its limitations. Yet one has a drive to teach, and one wants to teach people how to immerse themselves in the best books, not in mediocre books, not in books that are chosen because they represent one group or another, and I don't want to get into the cultural politics of that because I have now limped off so many cultural battlefields that I increasingly feel like my hero Sir John Falstaff, who is very glad indeed to get out of the Battle of Shrewsbury alive. So I also... Yes. I want to declare my warfare over, yes, even though my enemies won't let me, as I've discovered from many of the reviews of this book.
You consider them enemies?
No, I don't consider them enemies.
Okay.
They consider me an enemy. They have, I think, a mistaken notion of me. You can argue passionately that no one in the end is benefited by mediocrity, whatever the source of that mediocrity is. And people are bound to misunderstand you. And I have found myself very badly misunderstood. But, you know, it frequently amazes me, Charles. We would not buy a table like this one, no matter what the origin of the person who had made it, no matter what the, shall we say, sexual orientation of the person who had made it, no matter what the ethnic background of that person, if it was so badly made that as soon as it was delivered to us, the legs fell off. But I can't understand colleagues or ex-colleagues who, in effect, take a book, a novel, a poem, a play, a story, which is so badly written, so badly made, so badly thought that it's the equivalent of the legs coming off this table, and saying, its social utility more than justifies it because it represents voices not previously heard. That's not how you represent voices not previously heard. But here I am on a subject that I have vowed to get off.
Okay. So tell me why it was important to write this book.
I wanted to
to reach an audience beyond those that you could reach in a classroom, obviously.
Yes, I also wanted to reach some of the readers that I'd reached before in a book on the Western canon and in a book on Shakespeare and other books. But I wanted to do it without polemic as much as possible, even though I seem to be trapped to some degree in having by now a somewhat polemical nature, though I'm not happy about that. I would like to be different. Maybe a little hard at 70 to become different. I think that unless you read deeply and in your own interest, unless you explore what is most profound in what has come before you, then you never will get down to the recesses of your own self. You'll never learn what Ralph Waldo Emerson rightly called self-trust and self-reliance. And most deeply, perhaps, you never will heal the self. I think that in a culture which has all of the peculiar difficulties and complexities of the one currently developing around us, there is nothing more profoundly healing than the act of solitary reading, provided that what is being read is indeed permanent, deep, lasting work that calls for all of your faculties in response, work that calls you out of your own deep, as it were, work that transforms you, work, that is to say, Shakespeare, Dante, Dickens, Jane Austen. I mean, we know who these authors are. We neglect them, I think, at our own potential debasement.
Are you saying, I mean, how do you choose, better yet, how do you recommend people choose what they read?
Well, to some degree, of course, one would like to feel that they ought to follow their own nature, but these days that leads to all kinds of difficulties. One cannot be happy about the 35 million copies of Harry Potter. I had a piece in today's Wall Street Journal.
I saw the editorial, yes, the op-ed piece.
Yes,
We can't be happy about that?
No, I think that's not reading, because there's nothing there to be read. They're just an endless string of cliches. I cannot think that that does anyone any good. I mean, people tell me, well, at least the child is reading, to which my answer is no, the child isn't reading. That's not The Wind in the Willows. That's not Through the Looking Glass. That's not Charlotte's Web by E.B. White or James Thurber's The 13 Clocks. That's not really children's literature. It's really just slop. And I do not think it does anyone any good at all.
Okay, but then what are you saying? I mean, are millions and millions and millions of people wrong?
I'm afraid so.
You know, and why do you think they believe and desperately want to get this book? I mean, they're being overwhelmed at Amazon.com.
Yes, I know, Charles. But a lot of that is fashion, of course. You know, a lot of that is...
You read it because somebody else is reading it, or you read it because you think it's a thing to do, or you read it because it's the current thing?
It is the current thing, yes. It is a fashion. It's a period piece, a whole series of period pieces. The history of reading is strewn with a vast dustbin of period pieces, and in 5 or 6 years, these will be period pieces also. They will be of interest to sociologists. They will not, the people who read them will not be able to remember what they read.
How was Dickens treated when he wrote?
Oh, Dickens,
when he wrote,
was immensely popular, as Shakespeare was immensely popular as a playwright. Dickens had a vast kind of an audience. But come, Charles, we are both aware that there has been a tremendous debasement of popular taste. There has been a tremendous failure in education in the English-speaking world. Even my best undergraduates at Yale, and they are as gifted as any undergraduates I've taught at Yale, nevertheless come into my classroom having read remarkably little compared to...
So what's happened to us that gives us that kind of society in which people of the best young minds have not read well?
The screen.
Television screen, movie screen.
The television screen, the movie screen, and now overwhelmingly
Internet
the computer screen, and yes, in particular, the great gray ocean of the Internet, which frightens me deeply, because if young people go into or onto, whatever the proper terminology is, since I'm a dinosaur and know nothing about the Internet, but I know just enough about it to know that to differentiate between something in that vast and endless floating sea of stuff, to have the... go on.
No, you finish, because I just got a point.
You need some education. You need some cognitive, that is to say, intellectual standards. You need some sense of what aesthetic value is or is not.
Okay, my point I was going to make with you is one that you just essentially expressed, which is the notion that the development of a mind is the act of giving yourself the possibility to choose, you know. And if you take something like the Internet, which I love and adore, you know, we ought to be able to choose that which we enjoy, which provides new windows for us in a very interesting way. But Charles, and therefore it should not be dismissed as something that is turning us into a nation of illiterates.
Wait, you partly misconstrue what I have said, Charles. You were not educated by the Internet.
No, I wasn't.
Your standards of taste and judgment were formed before the Internet was available to you. You therefore represent a somewhat different phenomenon than the one of which I speak.
So you are saying that those people today, those young people who come to Yale, you know, never developed because of all these alternatives, an education that they may have received through readings which would enable them to make better choices and to make better use of this very quality mind they have.
Some of them developed, but even some of the best simply have not read enough. Reading is, in the end, even though one doesn't want to discourage reading groups which do good work, but reading is, in the end, a solitary activity, you know.
Yeah.
You're not really learning, I believe, how to speak to other people when you are deeply engaged in reading Shakespeare, or deeply engaged in reading Dante, or deeply engaged even in reading Cervantes. You're fundamentally learning how to speak to yourself. You're learning how to listen to yourself. You're learning the discipline of yourself. You are indeed in the act of discovering yourself. Some kind of preparation needs to be made before you have a young individual with the incredible, the endless range of the Internet coming at them all at once. I mean, they cannot just, as it were, surf endlessly. We none of us live forever. There's only so much time in the end to read. I mean, I remember that when I was getting into canonical arguments some years ago, I remember saying, and frequently making this point almost obsessively, that if we all basically lived, let us say, not 80 years, now that I'm 70, I will say at least 80, but 160, if in fact we could look forward to lifetimes twice our current length, I don't think I would ever have wanted to argue with anybody about canonical matters. I would have said there would be world enough in time in which people will find what is most worth finding. But our time is limited. We read against the clock. We read ultimately in the shadow of mortality. And I think it does matter immensely what you read and how you read it.
Let me tell you what I think. I think it is the incumbents of people like you, and why you write this book, and teachers, to be able to break through, and I'm a romantic, as you know, and a dreamer, as you know, to be able to break through and open, by the quality of their teaching and the quality of their understanding, open these minds up to the richness of what you want to pour this best of civilizations into. I really do. I mean, I think it's incumbent on the way those of us in a position to teach, to instruct, to have that exposition, crucial that we be creative in opening it up. And I think that's what this is about. But you can't be pedantic and you can't be...
Oh, I have been accused of many things, but not pedantic.
I know, but I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just saying, do you agree with me or not agree with me?
No,
Sort
I
of
think
agree.
I agree with you.
You think you do?
I think, well, there's an idealism in what you're saying.
Of course.
And I am moved by idealism and have some residual idealism in myself. But I think there are enormous obstacles now. I think that the tyranny of the visual is a frightening thing.
That could be the title of your next book.
No, I don't think so.
The Tyranny of the Visual.
No, I'm writing a book called Genius and Genius because I figure the next step is to defend the idea of individual genius itself and of potential genius.
Why is it under attack?
Oh, I think it's absurdly pushed aside by...
The idea of individual genius is absurdly pushed aside? I mean, don't we pay respect to that every day? The idea of individual genius?
Perhaps the public to some degree does. Oh. The universities have long since, I think, abandoned it and explained it away on the basis of one historical factor or another.
Explained it away meaning what?
Saying that Shakespeare is the product of certain historical forces, as it were. Yeah. Though this is not a very good explanation on their part, because then one wants to know why Thomas Middleton or some other contemporary of Shakespeare, John Fletcher or Francis
Beaumont, was not beneficiary of the same kind of historical forces.
Yes, was not equally,
right,
historically benefited.
All right, let's come back to this book only because I think it's terrific. What's in here?
Well,
I mean,
necessarily...
You've divided this along the same, you've got prologue, go ahead, you tell me.
Well, there's a prologue called Why Read?
Right.
And there's an epilogue about the whole question of why we choose to go on working after a certain point. Because I was brooding very hard on the fact that Shakespeare seems to have given up, which fascinates me. In the last 3 years of his life, he just stopped.
Stopped writing.
After The Two Noble Kinsmen, he could have gone on writing more plays. He did not do so. And why he did not is a fascinating question for surmise. But no,
well, why do you think?
I think he was ill. Even though many scholars disagree with me, I think he may well have been a syphilitic. I think also there had probably been a great deal of personal disillusionment, high romantic as this may sound, but also I think there must have been a feeling that he had reached his limits, that you couldn't really do what he wanted to do in a theater, and yet he wasn't about to go on to some other mode. No, most of this book is devoted to a series of brief, but I hope very useful readings of short stories, novels, both European and American, plays, including Shakespeare's Hamlet, to which I return, and poetry, a whole range of poems.
Now, you don't think it's just sufficient to read poetry. You should memorize poetry.
I think that we lost a great deal in education in this country and in other countries when we stopped teaching people to memorize. Obviously, just repeating something by rote without understanding does no good whatsoever. But to possess something by memory, to really read a poem hundreds of times because it can sustain hundreds of readings. To read a poem like the great anonymous poem, the greatest anonymous poem in the language, Tom of Bedlam song,
right,
which I mean, to hold in your heart and your memory. I mean, the astonishing ending of that poem, the supposed madman, who was a wandering beggar, a Bedlamite, sings with a host of furious fancies, whereof I am commander, with a flaming spear and a horse of air, to the wilderness I wander. By a night of ghosts and shadows, I invited am to a journey 10 leagues beyond the world's wide end. Methinks it is no journey, and I will sing any food, any feeding, drink, or clothing. Come, dame or maid, be not afraid. Poor Tom will injure nothing. When you have
30
that,
bare years have I,
yes,
twice 20 been enraged,
yes,
and of 40 been there 3 times 15. Endurance soundly caged on the lordly lofts of Bedlam, with stubble soft and dainty. Brave bracelets strong, sweet whips ding-dong, with wholesome hunger plenty.
yes,
And now I sing,
any food, any feeding, yes.
feeling, drink, or clothing,
Come dame or maid, be not afraid, poor Tom will injure nothing. We don't know who wrote
poor
the
Tom
poem.
will injure nothing.
It was found in a commonplace book, a manuscript book of 1620. But it has moments in it that, even though no Shakespeare scholar will agree with me, I can't think that anyone but Shakespeare could have written it. There's an astonishing moment in particular, which breaks my heart, where the singer, the madman, cries out, "The gypsies snap and Pedros are none of my camarados, the punk I scorn, and the cut purse sworn, and the roaring boys bravados," and suddenly you get an immense drop in it. The meek, the white, the gentle, me handle, touch, and spare not. But those that cross, Tom Rhinoceros doeth a panther, dare not. That astonishing ability to modulate the tone and intensity. It's one of the great lyric poems in the language. I think if you possess a poem by memory, then it begins to possess you. And you learn how to be alone with it. You learn it more and more deeply. It alters you, I think. It changes you. So I suppose, yes, I'm a great advocate of memorization.
What poem do you think that will be in your heart when you draw your last breath?
It's the very first poem that I quote in the book. It's a little poem by A.E. Housman, the very first line of which I find devastating. Into my heart an air, A-I-R, into my heart an air that kills. I mean, he means a snatch of song, but also he means indeed the air one breathes, and to say that kills one is shocking. Into my heart an air that kills from yon far country blows. What are those blue, remembered hills? What farms, what spires are those? That is the land of lost content. I see it shining plain, the happy highways where I went and cannot go again. It's an immensely simple poem, but it's astonishingly profound. And it covers, I think, the universal longing that we all of us have for the unlived life. But I wouldn't, at this point, want to anticipate what will be in my head at the closing moment. I don't think anybody wants to anticipate that.
The unlived life.
Well, the unlived life is perhaps one of the 4 or 5, one might risk saying, the 4 or 5 major reasons for great literature. Cervantes, in some deep sense, is giving one his own sense of the unlived life in the adventures of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. Dante in the Commedia, an exile cut off from the life he would have liked to have been living in Florence, is certainly commemorating that as a kind of lost vision. Shakespeare we do not know, because we know nothing essential or crucial about his life. His inwardness is wholly concealed from us, but very difficult to read the later plays and not feel an immense sense of regret for a life that you haven't quite ever had. And I suppose it is almost the major burden of lyric poetry, again and again. There are, of course, those who fight it. The great monologue that I emphasize of Ulysses, the great dramatic monologue by Alfred Lord Tennyson, is someone who refuses Ulysses to contemplate an unlived life. He's gotten back to Ithaca, he's gotten back to Penelope, he's gotten back to his son, he's gotten back to his people, his hearth, and he is not content, as he says, almost with a grand fury in contempt of it. He says, as though to breathe were a life. That isn't what he wants at all. And indeed, it's a poem I find peculiarly moving because he speaks to his mariners who are going to go forth on this last outrageous voyage with him, in which they're going to reach the limits of the known world, and then they're going to plunge down forever. And he says, though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that which we were, that which we are, we are. Tremendous, tremendous pride in that. And he ends by crying out, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. And I think Tennyson knows that his Ulysses is echoing Milton's Satan, crying out, and courage never to submit or yield. And what is else not to be overcome? That is to say, what matters provided you are not overcome? There is something profoundly selfish in Tennyson's Ulysses, and I think we are meant to hear that. He is based on Dante's Ulysses, who is down very deep in hell indeed as a false counselor. But the poem is powerful and ambivalent, and it, I suppose it appeals again to that frightening sense of the unlived life.
We talked about Tennyson and Housman and Blake and Landor and Browning and Whitman and Emily Dickinson, popular ballads. Anonymous, we talked about Shakespeare, we mentioned John Milton in Paradise Lost, William Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats. Then you go to novels, from Cervantes to Stendhal to Austen to Dickens, Dostoevsky, James. Then finally plays, and then finally novels.
I guess
part
I
two.
would want to mention one novel in particular before we come to an end. That frightening novel by Cormac McCarthy.
Would you consider what?
Blood Meridian.
Yeah.
A very great book. I think there's no better work of the imagination by a living American than Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. It is a frightening slaughterhouse of a novel. It's based historically upon a ghastly exhibition of filibusters organized by both the Mexican and Texan governments back in 1849 to 50 to clear the way to the gold fields by literally massacring the entire Native American nations of the Southwest. And this scandalous and historically based, this scandalous expedition sets forth, headed by a murderous fellow named Glanton, and presided over by a spiritual genius who's a sort of maniac named Judge Holden, who's a giant 7-foot white albino. It is perhaps, with the exception, of certain works of Faulkner, which clearly have influenced Cormac McCarthy, and certain works of Henry James, but still you would have to go back to Moby Dick to find an American epic as overwhelming as Blood Meridian.
Here's what you say, Blood Meridian seems to me the authentic American apocalyptic novel, more relevant even in 2000 than it was 15 years ago. The fulfilled renown of Moby Dick and of As I Lay Dying is augmented by Blood Meridian, since Cormac McCarthy is the worthy disciple both of Melvin and Faulkner. I venture that no other living American novelist, not even Pynchon, has given us books as strong and memorable.
Yes.
How to read and why. There's much more we can talk about, and we will again. Harold Bloom, thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles.
My pleasure.
Thank you, dear.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time. Be happy.
Like everybody else who turned 70, I am delighted to be here when one considers all the
alternatives. That's right. Who first wrote that? Was it Twain or somebody?
I think, well, Twain uses it, but it goes further back than that. It must be as old as humankind.
So people say, why is Harold Bloom, this great literary critic who writes about Shakespeare and ages of influence and lots of other things, why is he telling us how to read a book?
Well, we have reached...
Sounds like a self-help primer.
Oh, there is a self-help aspect to it, I'm glad to say. I mean, usually self-help books are pretty ghastly,
right,
as we all know, just as inspirational books, as publishers call them, are pretty awful. But I hope, and if what you remember is mediocre stuff, you're not going to be able to think very well. And if as a nation we stop thinking well, someday we will yet cease to be a democracy. It really matters reading the best that has been written ever, the best that has been thought ever.
We'll get to the substance and the content of this book, but is part of what motivates you now not sort of notions of mortality, but in a sense is I want to make sure that what I consider crucial and essential, one, Shakespeare and the invention of human, and the essential necessity of reading for pleasure and for discovery and for understanding where you fit. And that these are sort of, if nothing else, these are the messages I want people to know.
You know, that's pretty well right, Charles. One can teach, you can teach for 45 years as I have, and I hope I will teach another 15 or whatever, but you can teach in the end face-to-face only a certain number of students. Maybe by now, in my case, it must be 30, 35,000 students, but that still has its limitations, yet one has a drive to teach, and one wants to teach people how to immerse themselves in the best books, not in mediocre books, not in...
Harold Bloom is one of the greatest and most prolific American literary critics today. He is currently Sterling Professor of Humanities at Yale University and Berg Professor of English at New York University. He is author of more than 20 books, including The Anxiety of Influence, The Western Canon, and Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. In his most recent book, How to Read and Why, he stresses the importance of reading as a form of personal pleasure and essential to the discovery of self. I am pleased to have him here on his 70th birthday. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Charles.
How do you feel? See, first of all, I love you calling me Charles because, I mean, it so thrills me, I can't tell you. I could go the rest of my life and everybody could call me Charles. And I'd be...
This redeems both modes to some degree. No, this is an attempt to write an authentically reader-friendly book. I've been writing a lot of books through the years. I have been teaching for 45 years. I increasingly felt that I wanted to be much more simple and much more direct, and even if necessary, even more personal. And that I wanted to talk about how desperately we all of us need to keep reading. You can't think at all clearly or well without memory. And it matters a great deal what you remember.